Our Chapter 12 slide set, Part D, is going to be devoted to the helminths or worm. When we talk about the helminths, these are going to have some interesting features, and these are usually what people think of as the true parasites because they're much larger. They have very elaborate life cycles, and these are going to allow them to survive in multiple hosts. The helminths or worms are truly animals. They're chemoheterotrophs, and they're going to have true multicellular bodies, and this includes both tissues and organs. They are going to have an ingestive lifestyle. They do have a mouth, but many of them, because of their parasitic form of just literally living off of their host, they do also take in nutrients by absorption. One of the notable features is going to be that they have very elaborate life cycles for reproduction, and this is going to include eggs, larvae, and adult, so they do have embryo formation. Again, the most notable thing is going to be the form of what these look like, whether they're flat, round, and their elaborate life cycles. When we talk about the helminths or the parasitic worms, these are going to be divided into two major phyla. So we talk about the platyhelminths, or those that are flatworms. Flatworms can be further categorized down to their class as the trematodes, which are the flukes, which kind of look like a flattened leaf, and the cestodes, which are the long tapeworms, segments that kind of are together and look like this long stream of tape. The phylum of the nematodes is going to be the true roundworms and what are referred to as hookworms. When we talk about these worms, they are built for reproductive success, and they are the ultimate parasites. Parasites in general do not want to do harm to their host, so they don't make a lot of toxins or enzymes or other pathogenic or virulence factors. They literally just want to hang out. So because of that, they have adapted to their parasitic life cycle, and they tend to have reduced digestive systems. They are living, feeding off of their host. They don't really need to sense their environment that much. They don't have to find food. They don't have to defend themselves. They just try to get from host to host and be able to reproduce. Because they are usually being passed from host to host, they also have reduced locomotion. So all these systems are reduced, but in contrast, their reproduction is highly prolific. So they have very complex reproduction and life cycles that we're going to talk about. When we talk about the life cycle, the helminths can be either dioecious, meaning they have separate male and female individuals, or they can be hermaphrodites. One animal has both male and female reproductive organisms, so again, they are built for reproductive success. Even in the dioecious form, though, you usually find male and females are intimately coupled so that they are always found together to be able to reproduce very quickly. As we saw with the protozoa, we have both definitive and intermediate host. The definitive host harbors the adult, sexually mature form of the helminth, and the intermediate host harbors one of the larval or developmental stages. Again, being the definitive host or the intermediate host does not define that one is better or worse than the other, and so it depends on the parasite. Sometimes humans are the definitive host, and sometimes we are the intermediate host. Just a reminder, the drugs that treat parasites are going to be different. Oftentimes, these are going to have more toxic properties because the helminths being eukaryotic, that's problematic in and of itself. But remember the fact that these are pretty much just living with us, and trying to find ways to get rid of the parasite is oftentimes problematic. We're going to look at the life cycles and the classification of the major groupings and take a look at some of the diseases that may be associated. So we'll first take a look at the platyhelminths. These flatworms are flattened dorsoventrally, and again, they look like little flattened leaves. In the picture, you see a trematode, a fluke, next to a little coin. They have a ventral and an oral sucker so that they literally are just going to hold on and suck fluids from their host, but they can also take in nutrients by absorption through their cuticle. As you see, they are going to be hermaphrodites. They have both ovaries and testes, and the intestine pretty much is going to bathe those organs so that, again, most of the nutrients are going to their reproductive success. Their digestive system is incomplete. They have one opening for entry and exit, so things come in, circulate around, and they then go out the same way. So we'll take a look at the life cycle for two examples, the lung fluke, Paragonymous westermanni, and the cardiovascular fluke, the schistosoma. When we talk about the Paragonymous westermanni, we see an example of something where the parasite has multiple hosts. This hermaphrodite, the adult fluke, releases eggs into the human lung. We kind of cough them up and swallow them back down, and then the eggs get put out into the water, oftentimes excreted in the feces. In the water, they develop into the meriscedium, which is then going to infect another intermediate host. In this case, this is going to penetrate a snail host, and in that intermediate host, they go through a developmental stage where they make the Caesaria, which are inside these radia. The Caesaria then leaves the snail and enters things like a crustacean, a crayfish, as another intermediate host, and these are then going to encyst in their muscles. This is then referred to as a metacaesaria. We then eat these, especially if they have not been properly cooked, and therefore we see the life cycle continuing. For the schistosomiasis, we see that this is going to be a dioecious coupling, where you have the adult female and the male always coupled. The one, you see the female kind of laying in the groove of the male there, and they then have a mouth and suckers to be able to hold on. So being very prolific, the eggs reach the body of water, usually again being put out in human feces or urine, and these are then going to hatch and turn into those free-swimming marsupium. The snail is the host again. The marsupium are going to penetrate the snail, and then they develop into the cercaria in that intermediate snail host. However, these then do not have another host. They actually directly penetrate through human skin. They lose their tail and then release the cercaria, which then can travel through the circulatory system, getting into the intestinal blood vessels, where they then mature into adults. So schistosomiasis is fairly common down in South America, so you need to be careful when you are swimming in waters down in that area that you don't end up picking up this parasite. The cestodes are the tapeworms. These intestinal parasites completely lack a digestive system. All they do is use their scolex or head to literally burrow into the intestine, hold on, and make more. So they grow in length. You see what is referred to as the segments or the proglottids. They're very tiny by the head or the scolex, but then they start to mature and get larger at the tail end portion. These, again, being hermaphrodites, have both testes and ovaries, and the proglottids are then going to break off and be put out into the environment, where they are then going to, again, disintegrate, releasing the eggs. The major way that we become infected is by animal products that we ingest that are contaminated. So beef have their worms, the Taenia signata, pork, the Taenia solium, and humans, we become the definitive host. In the life cycle, the reason we become infected is because we ingest foods that have been undercooked. So in the meats of both our cows and pigs, we see the encysted form, and then as we ingest, they then are going to turn into these very large growing tapeworms. And again, people may not even know that they have them unless they start to get really big and you start sloughing off the proglottids. They are the ultimate parasite. They literally just want to hang out in your intestine and feed off of you. But again, they will start to rob people of nutrients. When you do start having problems with these parasites, it's usually because of they're depriving people of nutrients, or you start to have a very high parasitic load, which again can be problematic because of the waste products from the parasite. Besides the definitive host, Taenias, that meaning that we as humans are the definitive host for eating the Caesaria that are in the meats for beef and pork. We want to also talk about our dogs, not only from their own health, but from the fact that we can become the intermediate host for a dog tapeworm, which is Echinococcus granulosus. When we look at the life cycle, we can be an intermediate host, but we are referred to as a dead-end host. Normally what happens, you see the adult tapeworm is going to release eggs in its canine, and these are then going to be put out into the environment. So the canine is the definitive host. Out in the environment, these eggs hatch and the larvae migrate in and infect other animals. So these are going to become encysted in what is referred to as a hydatid cyst. The life cycle is then completed because canines then hunt these other intermediate hosts. We can also be an intermediate host. We can have these hydatid cysts, which basically are a brooding capsule for the parasite. However, we don't expect that our canines are going to eat their master, and so we become a dead-end host. It is problematic, however, that these hydatid cysts can get rather large and can impede and function. So they can sometimes be found in lungs, in the brain, in the liver. And so therefore, that is problematic for us as well, even though we're not completing the life cycle. The nematodes are the roundworms. They have a complete digestive system, meaning they have a mouth, an intestine, and an anus. And we can talk about those that the eggs are infective or the larvae. So here we're seeing what is referred to as Ascaris lambrocoides. This is the most common parasitic worm found in humans, and the eggs are what are infective for humans. The Ascaris lives in the intestine on the semi-digested food and excretes eggs in the feces. You will notice that unlike a tapeworm, which tends to just get longer and longer over time as it grows, you start to get lots of these roundworms in the intestine. And again, a high parasitic load starts you to have intestinal issues, and you will sometimes even slough off some of the worms themselves. But mostly, we think about the life cycle. The eggs hatch in the intestine, the larvae then migrate up to mature in the lungs. We then kind of cough them up, swallow them back down, and they migrate out the intestine, and the eggs are then put out into the environment. The issue is that the eggs can remain viable out in the environment for up to a decade, and so it's very easy to then have the accidental ingestion of these eggs. So it's the eggs that are the problem. We also see the pinworm Enterobus vermicularis as problematic for people as well. In this life cycle, we see that the organisms, the parasite is dioecious, so we see the larger female, and the male literally kind of wraps around her and is going to hook on, so they are always intimately together in the intestine. As they are reproducing, the eggs are then going to be put out at the anal area. So they migrate to the anal area and lay the eggs so that you end up having these eggs literally kind of sticking out on the anal area and becomes very itchy. It's very easy for once someone in the family is infected to get the eggs on both undergarments and bedding and towels. And so once you have these, they are problematic to try to get rid of. One of the old ways of doing the diagnosis was to literally take sticky tape to try to get the eggs off the anal area. They literally are kind of deposited there and are able to be viewed in that manner. Other nematodes, it is the larvae that infects humans. So larvae that infect humans are often in a category of what is referred to as hookworms. Necator americanus, the ankylostoma duodenal. So these live in the small intestine of humans, and then the larvae are put out into the environment. For the hookworms, the larvae then, as they are out in the environment, actually then can penetrate the skin on contact. So if you're trying to remember Necator americanus, think of this as people out on the farm without shoes on. Well, that's exactly what happens. The larvae then penetrate. They then travel via the blood or lymph into the lungs. Again, we kind of have this life cycle where we cough them up, swallow them back down, they migrate to the intestines, and the eggs are then shed out in the feces, and the life cycle continues. But it is the larvae that hatch out in the environment and are going to infect humans. One example of a hookworm that you might want to think about, hopefully we'll get to the beach this summer. We won't still be doing social isolation, although we don't know when that will happen. However, these hookworms can also be found in the sand. So there have been reports of people getting these hookworms. You can see the trail where the worm is kind of making its way. But there was a very notable case where this young man had allowed people to bury him literally up to his neck in the sand. He ended up with a terrible case of the hookworms, and the lesions that you see on the feet here were literally all over his body, and he ended up very badly scarred. So you want to make sure that you're trying to avoid these types of parasites. Another one that you might be familiar with causes a disease that people often refer to as elephantitis. That is because the larvae is going to infect into humans. We become infected from the mosquito as it takes its blood meal. And then we see the adult stage in humans. We have the production from the adults producing these microfilaria. They then end up blocking the lymphatics, and that's when you start to get this swelling as tissues do not drain. So again, this is an example of the larval form that is going to be put into the human host as the mosquito takes its blood meal. Other nematodes where the larvae infect humans, probably the best known is the Trichinella spiralis. Everyone, when they were back in the 50s and 60s, they were taught this little rhyme about trying to avoid getting trichinosis because it was so common from people eating pork. Nowadays, the most problematic nut is usually poorly cooked pork, but often problems with game animals as people hunt them and prepare them themselves. What happens is that with the Trichinella spiralis, it gets its name because this is going to have encysted larvae in the meat. You see there the encysted larvae kind of spiraling or curling up, and therefore we can get this as we poorly cook these meats and ingest the larval form of the parasite. We also have roundworms that are referred to as the anisaikines. These are wriggly worms that are transmitted to humans from infected fish or squid. Again, since oftentimes those types of foods may be eaten raw, you want to make sure that these do not contain these types of parasites. For the life cycle of the Trichinella, we see here that pigs became one of the major sources because they oftentimes were fed slop. It was basically the garbage on the farm, and this included undercooked meat items, even including pork, and other products from the pig during the slaughter. And so we see that the ingested cyst developed into the larvae cyst within the meat of the pork. Then we see that the adult worms that produce the larvae were going to then continue their life cycle by humans are going to ingest that meat if poorly cooked. And we see that as humans eat the undercooked pork, the contaminating cysts are then infective, and the trichinosis in humans, as we ingest the cysts, develop into the adults. The adults then reproduce, producing the larvae. The larvae then can go to arm muscles and cause a very painful disease. So again, cooking things well is going to prevent the transmission of this disease. Other of the types of larvae that infect, maybe not for humans, but we talk about the Dirofilaria immitis, the nematode that can infect and cause what is referred to as heartworm, especially in dogs. This is actually spread by mosquitoes, but interestingly, it needs a Wolbachia bacteria in order to develop. The Dirofilaria is able to infect dogs and cats, but we usually think of it more in dogs. Here you see an example of the proliferation of the worms, and obviously the load, the parasitic load here of having so many worms means that the heart is no longer going to be able to function, and that's why this is fatal. It can infect humans, but that doesn't occur very often. It's more of a problem for our pets. So make sure that you understand the difference between the different parasites, and say that you found a parasitic worm in a baby's diaper and you were trying to find out whether it was a tinea or a necator. Well, one of the ways that you can figure that out, is it flat or is it round? The tineias are going to be the cestodes, those tapeworms that we talked about, and necator is going to be one of those hookworms, so it would be rounded. So understanding the form and the life cycle of these parasites that are trying to just hang out in us, even though they're not trying to do us harm because they don't want to lose their host, they still can cause problems, and we definitely do not want to let ourselves or our pets become infested with these parasites. So besides the obvious ways that we can ingest some of these, we also see that many of these can be given to humans by these arthropod vectors. We see many of the different types of examples here, anything from the human louse to fleas, deer flies, and kissing bugs. All of these are going to be things that are able to transmit diseases. Ticks and mosquitoes come to mind as well. So when we think about the arthropods as vectors, the main class are going to be the insecta, so those lice, fleas, and mosquitoes. The insects have 6 legs versus the class arachnid. The arachnids are going to have 8 legs. Mites and ticks are those that are going to transmit disease as vectors. Note that spiders do not. So people are afraid of spiders, but the best that a spider can do is maybe have some venom, but it's not going to be something that is going to harbor these parasitic organisms. The crustacea, as we saw, crabs and crayfish can be part of the life cycle as well. So one of the things that you should know, assume you see an arthropod on your arm. How can you tell whether it's a tick or a flea? Well, first of all, fleas are going to jump, but they do only have 6 legs, whereas your ticks in the adult form have 8 legs. So when you're trying to get that tick off next time, maybe want to take a note at the number of legs, and that can be a way to identify. Just to note, some of the larval forms of the tick, though, do only have 6 legs, so you have to find the adult form in order to tell the difference between a 6-legged insect and the adult tick. So the arachnid is going to have the 8 legs. This is just some examples of human diseases. We will talk more about these in our microbial disease chapters, but just to give you a preview of some of the things to come, things not only like malaria, but we'll talk about dengue fever and yellow fever. We'll also talk about things like Lyme's disease and Rocky Mountain spotted fever and the plague as some notable arthropod-borne vector diseases.